Back to you for the rebuttal.
Sometimes, okay, so the first thing that Ben said is that Chomsky, um, I guess Chomsky, okay, so let's go back to what Chomsky does not do. He actually rejects the idea of dialectical materialism. So he has an ideal in his head. So, for example, and often he accepts bourgeoisie ideas of human rights. So, in order to avoid falling into this trap, let's remember that democracy doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's an idea that exists in the minds of people living under historical circumstances. So, we always need to ask democracy for whom and what kind of democracy. So he often says the US is a democracy but a failed democracy or something like that. But what he doesn't do is finally parse into details. For example, what is a worker democracy? It's whenever a worker democracy is when the will of the people can never overrule capital. In America, for example, a few years ago, there were many cities that banned fracking. And so what happened was that capital came in with ALEC and basically went to the state legislators and said, "Hey, cities, you can't ban fracking because you just don't have the right to ban fracking." And then so there, the capital actually overruled the will of the people. So to call America a democracy is a bit overstating it. It is a bourgeoisie democracy, but not a dictatorship of the proletariat. Um, that so Chomsky does is that he often abstracts the idea of class away from his analysis. So liberals also do this, and that's why they get this thing called the horseshoe theory, where they're just like, liberating Auschwitz is just as morally wrong as creating Auschwitz, which we know is false. So, for example, Chomsky repeats the old cliche about the people's stick. Like, but the people will feel no better if the stick which they are beaten is labeled the people's stick. Except he fails to analyze that who is holding the people's stick. If the people are holding the stick, we're going to beat up corporations like Amazon and Ford um, and defense contractors and imperialists and landlords. But if it's the corporations that are holding the stick, they're going to beat up people to make them work harder. So instead of that, it shows you that his analysis often just misses the basic point because he actually outright rejects materialism. He says it's some sort of gibberish. So what happens is that he often may have a detailed critique, but often it's not relevant, or it's not. It's just sometimes it's not relevant. So let's take the First Amendment example. He says America is the freest country, has a lot of free speech. But if we look at the history of the First Amendment, let's look at the case Brandenburg v. Ohio, a 1969 case where the court struck down an Ohio statute where KKK members were arrested for incendiary speech. So many during that time, including Chomsky, claimed that it was a positive step forward because it led to a reversal of prior decisions against communists. And guess what? After Brandenburg, we have Dennis v. U.S., and they upheld the CP-USA Smith Decision Act, so basically which allows the U.S. to kind of bar and purge communists. So in other words, the Supreme Court actually gave the Klan a pass that it had withheld from the communists for years, and then it reversed this decision just for the Klan member, and then reversed it back for the communists. So then you have to look at the thousands of examples of how free speech has been used in the U.S. For example, in the Supreme Court in Public Citizen v. Virginia Pharmacy, they invoked the First Amendment to allow deceptive advertising to pharmacies. We know Citizens United, and so
30-second warning.
Okay, when you look at Chomsky's analysis, it might look like it's deep, but he misses this class component that I just explained of the way the First Amendment is deregulatory when he talks about free speech. And and it is very important for people to understand the class component of every issue, because otherwise you cannot even figure out how to get power and even who opposes you as a basic step.
Okay, that's time. 5-minute rebuttal to you, Ben.
So I want to start out with just a quick factual correction. Esha just said that in Brandenburg versus Ohio, which, well, talk more about the details of that for a second, but that in that case, the Supreme Court was reversing this anti-free speech precedent for the sake of the Klan. But then,
no, I did not say for the sake of the Klan. I said, I'm sorry. I said the Supreme Court, when it was the Klan, it reversed it. That's different. I didn't say it happened because, but I said the Supreme Court
for the Klan. But I'm happy to use whatever wording you want. Lance, we started.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Start over the clock now. Okay. I mean, I got like 3 words out, but okay, that's fine. So, all right. So, in any case, that the presentation that I heard was that in Brandenburg versus Ohio, the Supreme Court, when the Klan's free speech rights were at stake, they made a very pro free speech decision, and that this decision was essentially reversed in Dennis versus United States, which had to do with the Communist Party. And I think actually not only is this wrong, but it's really interesting to look at why that's wrong and to relate that to Chomsky's views about free speech, and then get into some of these larger issues like what he means when he talks about materialism and whether there's something important about dialectical materialism that he's missing. So, as a matter of fact, it's the part that's correct was that Dennis versus United States was about the Communist Party, and Brandenburg versus Ohio was about the Klan. That's true. But actually, the Dennis versus the United States was decided in 1951, and Brandenburg versus Ohio was decided in 1969. So so the Brandenburg versus Ohio decision is the one that's up and running and relevant right now. It's not that they first made the anti-free speech decision or the pro-free speech decision and then reversed it. Right, first they made a more restrictive decision about free speech, and then they reversed it with the less restrictive one. And it's important to note that the reason that somebody like Chomsky, while obviously not liking the Klan, would be in favor of the Brandenburg versus Ohio decision actually gets back to something Esha said in her first statement, that she was faulting Chomsky for not supporting more militant tactics in the anti-war movement. I would argue that actually mass draft resistance was fairly effective. As were all kinds of other things the anti-war movement was also doing that Chomsky was supporting, like GI coffee houses, which led to resistance among GIs directly in Vietnam. But the effect of this, right? What was at stake in the Brandenburg versus Ohio decision, which of course didn't just apply to the Klan, right? Supreme Court decisions don't just apply to the petitioner. They then apply to everybody, was whether or not you can advocate things like sabotage without getting arrested for the mere advocacy. So I think if you're going to fault Chomsky for not supporting a riskier or more, in his view, tactically dubious set of tactics, I think it's also important to realize that it's wise to at least support setting the precedent that creates room for that. Now, Chomsky doesn't support anything like what sometimes strawmanned as a magic paper approach to the Constitution. I think that's as overwhelmingly clear. For the sake of timing, we can get into that in the back and forth. But I think he does understand that the need for the state to reproduce hegemony by using these legitimizing institutions does often lead to legal institutions like the Supreme Court recognizing rights that do actually create room for groups like, in fact, the Communist Party. So
30 seconds.
All right. What does Chomsky mean when he says that in certain respects the United States is the freest country in the world? He's talking about certain kinds of free speech rights. He also talks about how the corporations in which most Americans work are totalitarian institutions. I think if you look at the respects in which he thinks it's free and the respects in which it's unfree, I think it's actually a much better analysis than it might sound. And it's one that actually, even though he comes from a different tradition and doesn't use this terminology, does have a lot of dialectical nuance to it.
So here's the truth about the system.